Oil prices holding steady as tensions between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates escalated over the weekend, leaving the market with a few clues about how supply talks will proceed today, Monday, after discussions reached an impasse last week. Saudis are standing firm about raising output starting next month and extending the scope of the OPEC Plus agreement to the end of 22, while the United Arab Emirates wants better terms for itself. Failure by the group to raise supply may further squeeze the market, driving prices even higher, raising concerns over inflation. Let's look at Iran. Iran's oil minister is optimistic. He's optimistic about OPEC Plus meetings and that Iran will return to the markets if U.S. sanctions are lifted, regardless of the decision made by the group. Interesting. Mustapha Wahab, oil and gas analyst with Chapel Hill Denham, joins us to discuss further. Mustapha, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Exactly. Yeah? Good to always have you. First, I want to ask. We'll start with Iran. Are they overly optimistic about how talks of the nuclear deal with the United States can proceed? How do you see their optimism on returning to oil markets?
Nuclear deal. I mean, I think that there's a lot of foreign policies in play here, which is obviously not my expertise. But from economic angle, what I think is that it is in the best interest of Iran to actually come to the table, and negotiate clearly, right? I think in the last 1 year, since the sanction that was imposed by President Trump, Iran has suffered significantly. Over 2020, I think current account deficit was roughly around $4 billion, right? That is, put a lot of significant pressure as far as currency is concerned. Beyond that, inflation is well, above 30% levels, right? So a lot of economic, malaise is currently, going on with Iran right now, which basically means that, it makes sense for them to come to the table to negotiate with the U.S. What we're hearing is that, production for Iran in 2020 is anywhere between 2.5 million barrels and 2 million barrels per day, but oil export is well below, 1 million barrels per day, which is not making a lot of sense as far as, fiscal, expenditure is concerned, as far as for the government. So it then makes sense for them to come back to the market, to the table to negotiate with the U.S. such that the sanction will be lifted, and obviously they will come back to the market to start pushing oil.
I'm glad you mentioned Iran's output numbers because their oil minister, Bijan Zangane, says that there he is. He says that they could do 6 million barrels per day. Mustapha, where is he getting that number from? Is he just talking up the markets? And how can you go from under 1 million barrels per day to over 6 just because sanctions are removed?
I think we should not underestimate, the size of production that Iran can do. I think currently they hold about 10% of, 2P reserves of oil globally. Right, and at the peak of during the good days for Iran, I think they've done up to 6 million barrels per day before. I think that was roughly around 1976, and in the last few years, on average, they've only done around 2.5 million barrels per day. So does it make sense for them to come back, up to 6 million barrels per day? I think the answer is probably not. I mean, gradually we'll start. So our own estimate in-house in Chapel Hill is that anywhere between 1.5 and 2 million barrels per day could be added to the global oil markets, once the sanction is removed.
Speaking of those sanctions, thank you for that answer, Mustapha. Iran is exempt from the OPEC Plus output curbs because of these sanctions. Is it reasonable to assume that if the talks go well, the U.S. lifts the sanctions, that OPEC will not put the curbs on outputs, to try to manage
balance the market? Yeah. Now, it's unlikely, right? I think one of the things that you would have seen with OPEC is that, this coordination is actually very strong, for the cartel. Someone tweeted yesterday
what did they say?
It's because I mentioned Twitter. So
it's fine. It's too late. Go ahead.
I saw it on Twitter yesterday that many analysts have actually written the obituary of OPEC, but one way or the other, they've actually found a way to manage, the global oil market.
Right,
what I think is that OPEC would allow Iran to continue to push, production regardless of the levels. Perhaps Saudi Arabia will now come as the big brother, of the cartel, to basically take, some voluntary cuts. They did that in March, where they actually volunteered to cut anywhere between 1.5 and 1 million barrels per day, crude production. I think that would probably be the thing that would repeat itself. For them to include Iran, it's almost unlikely.
What do you make of the impact on markets if if Iran is to return to the markets?
So here, that's where our own downside risk to oil price comes in. Really, I mean, we're anywhere between $74 to $75 per barrel currently. A lot of global houses have actually raised their forecast to 70 million. Us in Chapel Hill, we think that once Iran comes back to the market and then start pushing a lot of oil into the market, possibility that we'll start to see some sort of downward pressure as far as oil price is concerned. So for us, we're still, anywhere between, $60 to $65 per barrel on average,
right.
Over 2021.
Mustapha, can we say that sanctions on Iran, civil war in Libya, Venezuela, and the never-ending issues they've had, that these factors have helped OPEC Plus to curb supply?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, OPEC has always just find their way. I mean, we have to give them some sort of kudos, right? In 2020, when pandemic hit the world, we saw oil price, decelerating up until, I think, $28 per barrel levels, the lowest that we've seen, historically. And then we start to see that, cartel coming back, coming together on the table, agree on, production cuts. I think at the time it was around 9.7 million barrels per day. So the impact of that is now gradually lifting, oil price. So, I mean, obviously, we think that, OPEC would continue to manage the situation and perhaps, keep oil price at elevated levels.
Speaking of OPEC managing the situation, another situation that's going on is, of course, this back and forth between the Saudis and the UAE. Yeah. How do you see all what's happening between them?
At the end of the day, I mean, today is going to be the meeting. I think that they would come to the table to agree on a cut or on a deal, right? I think the key tussle right now is that UAE is actually asking for a new production benchmark to calculate their own cuts from 2.3 million barrels per day to 2.8, right? And it's not like the cartel cannot, allow them to do so, but the fear is just that, other members of the will now start to ask for the same thing. In Nigeria currently, we are suffering significantly. I mean, this is about the first time where you see oil price rising, and then the impact on fiscal expenditure is quite small, right? I checked in Q1. Q1 oil price rose by around 37%.
Wow.
On a quarter-on-quarter basis.
Wow.
But oil export proceed for Nigeria was down roughly 23%. And that's basically because of the fact that our production is capped. And we also saw that liquid production in Nigeria was down around 1.7 million barrels per day. So the impact of this higher oil price, across the member countries is not really equal. Some people are enjoying stronger fiscal revenues, others are not seeing the impact. For Nigeria, we still have to pay subsidy on higher oil prices, which basically put us in a very tight corner. So if they should allow UAE to change their production benchmark, it then means that other people in the other countries in the cartel will start to ask for the same.
And then all types of chaos comes out of that.
Exactly.
Well, I know we'd like to end the show on an optimistic note, but what if because this meeting now, this is pushed the second time, what if we don't have an agreement? What if UAE sticks to his guns and says, nope, give me my own restructured outputs, what if things don't get fixed? What happens to the markets then?
I think the good news is that there is already an agreement on ground right now. The current disagreement is whether or not they want to push the current agreement, to the end of 2022. Okay. So for now, between, August, September, October, there's still a lot of, agreements currently within the cartel, which could, still keep, oil price, production, oil markets in balance, and that would obviously support, oil prices. But beyond 2021, for 2022, that's when we should start to worry whether or not, an agreement is reached.
Interesting, and that's a year to elections here in Nigeria. Back to the obituary, as it were, on social media. Is OPEC Plus still a relevant body?
Indeed, they are indeed relevant. They've done a lot. From 9.7 million barrels per day cuts, back in June 2020, down to the current production agreements. So they've done a lot. Oil price was down significantly, and it's now up, well above $75 per barrel. If you had asked anybody at the start of this year that oil price will reach this level that we're currently seeing, anybody would have argued with you. So kudos to OPEC, and I feel like they are still significantly relevant. So nobody should write the cartel off.
Mustapha Wahab, oil and gas analyst with Chapel Hill Denham. Thank you so much for talking to us about the oil markets. I always appreciate your analysis and insights, Mustapha.